Hi there, my name is John Kyo and I'm delighted to be at the 18th annual GFSS Symposium. So the topic or the theme is back to the buffet, food safety in a post-COVID world. My name is John Kyo and in session one I want to go through managing supply chain risks during a pandemic and beyond. Today what I'd like to go through is ecosystems complexity. I'll also share some thoughts on transparency and trust. And I will define both of those constructs. Then I'll introduce something that's relatively new for most people. It's called weak signal detection. And I'll have some concluding remarks. But before I get into all that, I just want to build a picture of transparency and trust challenges in global food supply ecosystems. So this is a simplification of the global food chain. If you look on the right-hand side, this meal is some fish, potatoes, and some vegetables. And each of these colored lines represents the supply chain. If we look at the potatoes, you buy them at retail at a mall. They buy them from a wholesaler, who buys from a packing house, who buys from multiple farms. And the first challenges start with products like potatoes and vegetables that go through a packing house, and they get commingled with other products. They get grated, washed, and then probably cut up. If it's vegetables like leafy greens, and if it's potatoes, they get sized and sold. So the challenges in traceability and supply ecosystems starts at the farm, of course, but it gets more complex when you get into packing house operations. And herein, batch control or lot control becomes very important. But if you look at the complexity of the rest of the supply chain here, and you're sitting down for your meal with your family, you're probably asking yourself, what species of fish is this? I thought I bought wild salmon, but is it really wild salmon or is it farm salmon? And as a consumer, how would you know? Was the animal feed as safe in the supply chain? And is my milk diluted or adulterated? These are things that come up in other countries. When I was living in Vietnam, about 3 years ago, the laboratory that I was working at found melamine in animal feed. We thought that the melamine crisis was over in China, but it's not. It just moves slightly in the supply chain. Some countries are dealing with dilution of milk or adulteration of milk, and unfortunately, this has driven the need for testing for animal DNA in plant-based milks and vice versa. So consumers are also focused on things like, buying healthier products and buying organic products. But how would they know if the food is really organic? You have the USDA organic certification, which is quite strong. And when you have a label like that, USDA organic, it actually sends a very strong signal of trust to a consumer because the government was involved. Now, what I really like about the USDA organic is they provide a website where a consumer can go and verify if the company in that product is actually truly verified as USDA organic. But they go one step further. Because anything that has a very strong signal of trust, it's called a credence claim. And a credence claim, like USDA organic, is something that the consumer cannot verify before or after purchase. So when you send that strong signal of trust to a consumer, you also become a high risk for fraud and counterfeit. So the USDA actually does something really nice. They provide a list of fake USDA organic certifications on the global market. And hopefully as they make these notices out there and they fine companies, that these products actually do come off the market. So this is very much a snapshot. But of the 151 products that I saw on that list of fake USDA organic a couple of months ago, the largest portion was in the US, followed by China. And I believe that more organizations that do provide these credence claims or certifications and labels on food products, they should also do the same. I know that one of the fish farming certification bodies does publish a list of companies in Vietnam that they have deregistered. And I think that's important from a transparency perspective. Now, as you build this picture here, is my honey pure or adulterated? We know that we've had lots of issues worldwide with honey and different sugars being used. Is there chemical or pesticide residue present in my products? Are there allergens present? Is this claim of 100% beef correct? We remember the horse meat scandal. What is the nutritional profile of the product? And is this rice and coffee really from Vietnam? Again, when I was living in Vietnam, not to pick on Vietnam, but you can have local traders who may be creative and buy cheap carrots and potatoes from China, roll them in the local dirt, after they wet them, and try to pass them off as local produce. And herein is the first challenge with blockchain. Many of the blockchain solution providers confuse data provenance with scientific provenance. Think of scientific provenance as the chemical fingerprint that's actually in the product, influenced by the air, the water, and the soil itself. They create a unique fingerprint for that product. And I have about 6 or 7 different videos on YouTube, on my channel on YouTube, with scientists that actually explains what scientific provenance of a food product is. Where the blockchain guys fall down is they forget to mention the term data provenance. So you may even hear some people from standards bodies saying we can track the provenance of a product through the supply chain. No, you cannot do that. Provenance is the geographic source or origin, and unless we have an earthquake, the actual ground is not going to move. What they really mean is they can track the data provenance through the supply chain. So watch out for that. Ultimately, what we want to know is my food safe to eat? And down at the bottom here, I've just made a note just as a reminder that it's really natural sciences that enables transparency and trust with objective certainty in terms of the ascertainable and verifiable characteristics of food products. In other words, all of the things that are on this page here are not the realm of software. They're the realm of science. And the clever software companies have embraced the science, embraced the analytical laboratories, and they can include them into their solution. So as we move forward, I've recommended to many jurisdictions and organizations that they should consider the 5 pillars of the food system. Many times we just generalize when we're talking about the food industry, but we have to not forget that we have food quality issues, and the labeling and the certification and claims are in the food quality space. Then we have food safety issues. We have food authenticity issues, and the opposite to that, of course, is food fraud. And we have a lot of cheaters out there. We have food defense issues. Now, whereas food authenticity and food fraud is counter-criminal, food defense is generally counter-terrorist. So the focus on that is quite different. And then, of course, we have food security issues. Now, food security has nothing got to do with the security of the actual food itself. It's about having sufficient and adequate and nutritious food to meet the daily needs of humans. So some companies and some governments have a horizontal focus and a vertical focus. Across these areas, you need very, very specialized skills, especially in the area of food defense. Also in food quality and food safety. There's no one person in an organization that can cover all of these areas. Yet, having horizontal expertise may be one of the key things to develop within organizations. So let's move on to transparency. What is supply chain transparency? Well, if you look at all of these products here, I actually want to take out the supply chain and replace it with food supply ecosystems transparency. And the reason for that is that each of these products here represent a different supply chain, or slightly different or nuanced. They may all come from different countries. And a project that occurred at, was sponsored and commissioned by APEC, Asia Pacific Economic Collaboration, looked at the services supply chain for food. And in one of the member states, Chile in South America, bringing wine to market, they determined that they need 70 different services, 70. What does that mean? That means that 20 of those services were done internally within the company, 21 were semi-outsourced, and 29 were fully outsourced. So think about that for a moment. Most of the time we focus purely on the product supply chain, but we forget the services component. And 29 of those services were fully outsourced. Now, some of those could range from transportation and logistics, but it's also the food safety guy that comes on the farm to do the inspection. It's also the agronomist that comes on the farm to work on the vines. It's also the pest control people. But how do we know if their companies are actually certified and qualified? How do we know if the staff are competent? If we have a food safety issue later, or we have a pesticide residue in the wine that's above what's approved in a particular country, how do we trace that back? Hence, I want to introduce and start to encourage you to start thinking more of a system. Food is a system, or multiple ecosystems that are actually connected together. Think of during COVID, when we had lack of mobility of employees. So we may have the produce in the ground, we may have the fruit on the trees, but we have nobody to pick them. If any of these ecosystems that are connected fails, we have what I call the cascading consequences of system failures. Like what's happening now in the US. Even if they could unload all of these ships in the ports along the west coast of the US, they don't have the drivers. Not only do they not have the drivers, they wouldn't have the storage capacity as they move those products through the US supply chain. So think about that. Think of all of these different ecosystems that are connected together. So when we go back to transparency, we can talk about sincerity, clarity, openness, believability, and a lot of other terms that are used to describe transparency. My favorite definition of transparency is really, it's about transparency of a net chain. Now, this is from Geert-Jan Hofstede. He's a professor at Wageningen University. And in this definition, he talks about a net chain. A net chain is the conflation of both the network and the supply chain together. This is one of the most beautiful yet simplest definitions to understand with transparency. Transparency, by the way, is not traceability. Transparency is about visibility of information, data and information. So transparency of a net chain is the extent to which all of the net chain stakeholders have a shared understanding. Now think of how could they get a shared understanding? Think of GS1 standards. And it's also access to information. If you have the information but nobody has access to it, it defeats the purpose. And it's product related information that they request. Very important as well. I was speaking with a CEO of a Chinese e-commerce platform who told me that their company decided to put a lot of effort into providing information about all of the analytical testing that was done on the products. And I believe there was 6 or 8 or even 10 pages of PDFs that they included with every order. And they were very happy with their work. And then they reached out to the moms who were buying the products, and the feedback was, you scared us. We didn't ask for these. And also we don't need it. So that was a revelation for the company. The company thought that they would be radically transparent. And I don't believe we should be using that word radically transparent, because we need to figure out how to do simple transparency. So it's information that they request without loss, noise, delay, or distortion. Now think about that. The loss and the delay come through a lack of interoperability with systems. The noise and the distortion, unfortunately, it can come from our marketing friends or sales or somebody that's exaggerating on a claim for the product or making a claim that's not actually accurate or permitted by regulations. There's also different aims and layers of B2B transparency in supply ecosystems. So down at the bottom here, what Hofstede advises is you have history-based transparency, then operations-based transparency, and strategy-based transparency. So different aims and layers. Now, if you look down at the bottom here, it's typically mandatory. History-based transparency, this is where traceability is. This is where the mandatory compliance with regulations are. And this is where blockchain is. So using a blockchain in a supply chain is history-based transparency. And it's also like looking in the rearview mirror of your car at what happened in your supply chain. Now, I know the people that are hearing me say this for the first time, you're shocked and you go, oh, hey, John, you're not right. That's incorrect. Blockchain is going to get us to the future. The answer to that is yes and no. Blockchain is a registry of transactions. If you layer on top of that IoT, you'll get operations-based transparency, which is the real-time sharing of information bidirectionally. And then using AI and machine learning, you can go out and predict what a market may do and start to do this strategic planning with your business partners. And this is what we call, or what Hofstede calls, strategy-based transparency or strategic transparency. Now let's move on to trust. Again, what is supply chain trust? I changed that into food supply ecosystems trust. So again, many words that can describe trust: reliance, sincerity, competence, credence, assurance, and so on. Now, Rousseau went out with a number of academics, looked at all of the different definitions of trust out there. And by the way, when I looked, there was about 140 different definitions of trust. So what Rousseau et al. Did, they pulled together and they came up with this definition, which I really like. Trust is a psychological state comprising the intention to accept vulnerability based upon positive expectations of the intentions or behaviors of another. So what does that mean? It means that this family, when they sit down in the restaurant, they're accepting a vulnerability because the preparation of the food is out of their control. But they have a positive expectation of the intentions or behaviors of another. So they believe that everyone in the supply chain, from the farmer to the workers, to the processors, to the packing houses, to the distributors, to the retailers, and then into the restaurant, that every single person in that supply ecosystem worked on their behalf. That's a tall challenge. Should we believe that? Is that where we should place our trust? Unfortunately, not in the food industry. Because in the food industry, we need to trust, but we need to verify. Because we have a lot of cheaters out there. And this is why we had food safety management systems. This is why restaurants and food service get trained to bring safe, nutritious products to the market. And this is where, as my good friend Frank Yanis, the Deputy Commissioner at the FDA, focuses on a food safety culture. A food safety culture is all about behavior. When somebody isn't looking, I should say, will that operator do the right thing? So behind this is really a strong focus on food safety culture. What I also want to point out is that when you start these relationships in supply chains or supply ecosystems, it's a journey. You're not going to get collaborative-based trust overnight. But when you do start at the initial stages, beyond orders, little information is shared. This is the history-based transparency. And as you move up, you get more familiar with working with your trading partner. You move up beyond transactional trust, where you're sharing order histories and medium-term forecasts are shared, and you're looking at short-term horizons. And as you start to mature the relationship further, you get into relationship trust, a relational trust, and then up to collaborative trust, which aligns with the strategy-based transparency from Hofstede. So I would encourage you to look at this, but the key point of this slide, of this message, is that You have to build trust over time. And what I'll share in a few minutes is that transparency and trust need to be matured together. So here's two frameworks that I have edited. And these comes originally from Frentrup and Teuvissen. And on the left-hand side, you have the 3 levels from Hofstede. And then you have 3 levels of trust from Shapiro et al. Again, as I mentioned earlier, history-based transparency is the classic track and trace. It's defensive in nature and focused on the past, what has happened. I call this on the left-hand side RMT, or regulation-mediated transparency. And on the right-hand side, calculus-based trust. This is where you have regulations. This is where you have laws related to food, and this is where you have contracts. And the basis of this is mistrust. Mistrust, by the way, is based on experience, where distrust is based on suspicion. We went through the definition of trust earlier. So you have trust, mistrust, and distrust, all nuanced differently. The notion here is that if you want to be strategic in your business and focus on strategic-based transparency, let's say you're the sales and marketing VP, but the back end of your organization is focused still on calculus-based trust. In other words, building in so many rules and penalties into your contracts that they're stuck down in calculus-based trust. It just won't work. What needs to happen up on the top right-hand side here is winning over the hearts and minds of your supply base. This is based on the common intentions, values, and norms. And when you get up to that level, this is where you can start introducing technologies that, let's face it, many organizations are afraid of, because they're afraid that their information may be shared or exposed. But it's only when you mature both transparency and trust together that you can start even thinking about deploying advanced technologies in your supply ecosystems. But notice here that once you move from operational-based transparency up to strategic-based transparency, the basis of trust building is voluntary. And that's important to note. So weak signal detection. This, fortunately or unfortunately, is the world we live in. This is a great slide from Shift. And so today's food systems comprise of multiple complex ecosystems with many, many different stakeholders, countries, languages, thousands of technologies and tools, essential services, regulations that all aim to produce and distribute safe and nutritious foods. But a shock can come from anywhere. Now, I've been using this slide since well before COVID. So we can add COVID as one of those shocks. So if you want to start thinking about building resilience into your supply ecosystems, you got to look at what's happening on the front end, what's happening at the back end, and how do you connect all of this together? So you'll see up at the top right-hand side here, food security. Many people said during COVID, and they're still saying it, that we have food security issues. Now, outside of the countries where we know that they have problems with food or access to food, the Western developed countries never actually had a problem with food security. They had a problem that I call food uncertainty. And that food uncertainty came about, as far as I can see, because we have a lack of visibility into our supply chains, and we have a lack of interoperability. So we didn't know where the food was and in what condition. That's food uncertainty, not food security. But something else went wrong here. We've all seen the shelves were empty, and we blamed consumers for hoarding, and we said, oh, look at those consumers, they're selfish, buying all these cleaning products and toilet paper. Well, you know what? This is actually predictable behavior. And social science tells us that this will happen. When consumers, when citizens, when humans are faced with an existential threat, they don't know their future, they don't know whether they'll live or die. They gravitate towards utilitarian tasks like cleaning, hoarding, cooking, and so on, because they believe they're contributing to their survival and collective survival. So that hoarding and panic buying was not selfishness on behalf of consumers, it was helplessness. And I want you to think about that. And I want organizations and governments to think about how they can tap into social sciences. They forgot about social sciences during the pandemic. And think about what happens when there's a storm in the US or a storm in any country around the world. And I know for sure the news that comes from the US when there's a major storm coming in, they actually show you inside of supermarkets with empty shelves. They show you people walking through parking lots to their cars and trucks with lots of bottles of water and food supplies. So this was predictable behavior. And on the left-hand side with the back end, things happened that weren't so good. We could have modeled this if we started to think in systems. We would have caught some of these problems, because in the middle here, when some of the processing factories closed down, what actually happened? The pig farmers or the hog farmers on the left-hand side, they had to keep feeding their hogs, and I believe that they would accumulate 1 to 2 pounds extra per day. So when these processing plants opened up again, the hogs were physically too big to fit into the pens at the processing factories. As a result, hundreds of thousands of them were euthanized. We have to start thinking in systems. We have to start thinking in ecosystems that are connected together. And we have to start thinking about the cascading consequences of a system failure, whether that system that's failing is access to human resources, workers for the fields, trucks, or ingredients. And that's the key message that I have from this slide here. So can technology help us to detect weak signals on this journey? Weak signals, according to Anzoff, are external or internal warnings that are too incomplete to permit an accurate estimation of their impact and or to determine a complete response. So here's a model from MacDonald and Corsi that myself and Carl Eunice applied. We overlaid on top of this risk management and disruption management slide from MacDonald Corsi the notion that we can use technology as a tripwire. And we can also use it as a circuit breaker. So in other words, the intervention. Now we've been using these terms since very early in the COVID response, so they're not related to COVID per se. But think about this. The technology, if we deploy it right in our supply chains, could act as a tripwire for something that may occur. The circuit breaker is giving us a mitigation strategy before it occurs. Now let me tell you why that's important. If you look at these examples again from MacDonald and Corsi, you look at, let's say the line D here, there was a product quality failure. Did a plan exist? Yes. Was it used partially? Was it rehearsed? Was unknown? The discovery took weeks. The recovery took months, and it cost $100 million. Even for problems that were identified the same day, the recovery could take weeks, months, or years. So I want you to think about that, and I would suggest you look at some of the work coming out of MacDonald and Corsi and other work in this area that can show us how technology can be used as a tripwire and also as a circuit breaker. This is an example of what if fuel consumption dropped by 75%? Just a scenario, event simulation. In this model here, and this actually happened during COVID, that our gas demand went down by, I think, about 85%, much higher than this. So that impacts the gasoline price and also oil prices. Ethanol suffered again after that. Ethanol price went down, and then there was a gap between ethanol demand and the supply. What happens then? Ethanol plants started to close down in the US and Canada. But then you look at how do we make ethanol? You have allocation of corn. And think about that. You have corn production then, and you have corn ethanol production. What is the impact here? The corn that was used for ethanol production in the US accounts for 38.3% of the corn production in 2017, 2018. That's significant. So again, the likely event that could occur here through this scenario is significant corn surpluses, and then decisions that organizations need to take. Should we plant less now, or should we focus on exporting more? But on the other side, with the corn ethanol production, it's also used for making hand sanitizer. It's also used for the CO2, so those bubbles that we get in our gas. So the likely event, what if the CO2 production dropped 50%? That would have an impact on food, feed, beer, soda, medical, and industrial. And this actually happened where the White House in the US actually had to intervene and figure this out. This is possible. This is scenario planning. And this is something that we've lost focus on. So my concluding remarks: transparency is no longer optional. Transparency and trust must be matured together. Technology does not replace natural sciences. Remember that very first slide I had showing the supply chains and all of the claims from software companies? It's natural sciences that actually does that work. Systems thinking is a vital skill to develop. Think tripwires and circuit breakers. Now, just on this point, for those of you not too familiar with the technologies, let me give you a simple example. Imagine you're driving in your car and you're using a GPS. And the GPS tells you that there is an accident 1 kilometer ahead. This is what I'm talking about. If you apply that in the supply chain, it's telling you that there is an accident 1 kilometer ahead. And then it's telling you to get off the highway at the next exit, which is the circuit breaker. Now think of trying to apply that within your supply chain. And the data and information quality is critical to success. Think about GS1 standards. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed this, and feedback is always welcome.